Thank you for the kind invitation. I've been invited today to speak on international law in Gaza. And even if I say so myself, that is a vast topic. So I would like to streamline it given the time constraints I have and start my case by first initially talking about my understanding of how international law has developed over the past few centuries, what has been or could arguably be its actual real motivations. And in that context, we would better be able to rationalize and understand the failings of international law when it comes to Palestine and Gaza. As I initially said, would like to begin and build up my case on how international law, as we see it and understand it today, came about, what were or could arguably be its real motivations, and that how could that help us rationalize the utter and complete failing of international law when it comes to protecting the life, liberty, security, dignity, and sovereignty of Palestinians, with the focus of what's happening in Gaza right now. One can say, if we're not looking at older civilizations like Mesopotamia or in India, if one were to look at, say, relatively modern states, one could trace back the development of international law to the Treaty of Westphalia. And those of who were not aware, the Treaty of Westphalia brought an end to a 30-year religious war as well as an 8-year war between the Dutch and the Spanish. And primarily, what European powers at that time intended to achieve was bringing an end to a pan European identity, which was existing in the face or in the form of the Holy Roman Empire. And they asserted or they argued that religious wars are to no avail. We should learn to coexist, we should learn to tolerate each other, and we should respect each other's boundary. And secularism was also a notion which was promoted through that treaty and understanding. And what they intended to bring about was an end of the papal authority or the authority of the Catholic Church in the affairs or internal affairs of European countries. However, despite all of that talk of tolerance and coexistence, what really happened was that certain European actors who were dominant, they regrouped themselves, they realigned themselves, this time not on the lines of religion or dynastic politics, but more so on the lines of their economic prowess, their military prowess, and how they can continue to use that to first dominate other smaller players in Europe. So even though the Treaty of Westphalia can be seen as bringing about peace in Europe, but major players in Europe continue to dominate and rule and subject smaller players like Finland, like Ireland, like Poland to occupation and to tyranny, and as well as there were other wars which existed and happened. The primary target was the Holy Roman Empire, which could currently be described as modern day Germany, which existed at that time in a form of, say, more or less 300 odd independent entities. And they were and they were allowed to be colonized or be used or serve the influence of the major players like Spain, France, and Britain and others. And that continued for a time without much revolt. And when it came to colonizing the rest of the world, we realized that to go to war with it. And that was seen in 1884 during the Berlin Conference, when over negotiation tables, the entire continent of Africa was divided amongst European powers. Of course, when we talk about colonizers sitting and negotiating which area and which people and which group they get to rule, they are not really talking about human dignity, human life, liberty, and human values as they today espouse or claim to abide by. And we see that similar model was adopted after the First World War. After again the First World War, they attempted to limit the Prussian control and influence over Europe and subject German land to control of other European powers, which the German by that time started to consider a collective humiliation. And this is a point I would like to stress upon here. When the Treaty of Westphalia happened, Germany existed as a group of 300 odd entities. There was no sense of national unity. There was no sense of collective dignity. By the time the First World War happened, Germany, for most part, had united under Prussian rule by 1871, and it did feel first a collective sense of unity, and because of that, a collective sense of dignity, and because of that, a collective sense of humiliation. And that's why we saw that the Treaty of Versailles did not really was a success as far as Europe was concerned, and very soon it was followed by the Second World War. However, the Treaty of Versailles was also used to apply the model which was applied to the Holy Roman Empire in the 1700s to what was now the Ottoman Empire. And the united and the unified Muslim identity was first broken down into non-Arabs and Arabs, into non-Anatolians and Anatolians. And the Ottoman Caliphate seat was ended, the Ottoman control was ended, and new nation states, which were formed out of thin air, and new identities were given to them in the form of, say, Jordan, Iraq, and Saudi Arab, and all of those entities which were brought about. And for most part, leaders who initially came to power in these regions were those who were loyal to their colonial masters. And furthermore, what survived thereon, and as we had seen during the 1950s and 60s, that even though the united Muslim identity for most part had been broken, what did survive still was a united Arab entity, which leaders like Gamal Abdul Nasser from Egypt tried to revive. And for most part, for the 19th century, we have talked about Arab nationalism and Arab unity, and we have seen a lot of Arab countries going to war with Israel over over the Palestine issue or over the Gaza issue, and we've seen those battles in the past. But we also see now what we label as the great betrayal of Palestinians or the great betrayal of Gaza, when we see even adjoining and neighboring countries of the Arab world now not only officially recognizing Israel, but doing its bidding, helping its control its public relation, helping its control any battles or wars with Iran, helping and control and manage any outflow of refugees or aid in and outside Israel. And how that has come about, I will come to that as well. So what I was trying to first build my case upon was what has the intention been behind these treaties. That always there has been talk of human rights, equality, democracy, dignity, but mostly and for most part, it is dominant actors who are trying to reshape and regroup and reshape the world as they like to control and rule it. So it's more so not to eliminate war, it is primarily to control and regulate war. And we see that the UN Charter or the United Nations being, say, inheritor of those same values as was seen as in the Treaty of Westphalia and the Treaty of Versailles, again came about talking about nation states, talking about universal Charter of Human Rights, talking about universal values which everybody should espouse to, and giving us an image that this is a horizontal system where all modern states are seen as equal partners and equal negotiators, and they would have equal say. But what we see is that the understanding, the interpretation, the reasoning, and the logic which is enforced throughout the UN is not horizontal, is in a way hierarchical, because it is primarily Western values, Western understanding, and Western interpretation of laws, which actually throws UN into any kind of action for that matter. For most part, it remains inactive. And we have seen that through UN, which is, though claims to be a horizontal system, is not a democratic system, because the veto power is exclusive to only 5 members within the United Nations Security Council, and it is not available to all member states. So, and before coming to Palestine, I'll slowly give you some examples of how in the past, say, 20, 30 years, international law has either been ignored or been manipulated or been broken or been suspended, again to serve the interest of certain dominant powers. They say and talk about that international law was key in bringing an end to the Kuwait invasion by Iraq. What most people don't talk about is that the United States ambassador, in the week leading to the invasion of Iraq, apparently greenlit the invasion of Kuwait by telling Iraq that any Arab conflict is not our issue, and any oil dispute or border or territory dispute you may have does not consult the United States. And Kuwait at that time was being accused of doing slant drilling and exploiting Iraqi oil reserves. When Iraq actually invaded Kuwait and launched that operation, then suddenly the United States turned around and the United Nations turned around and they said enough is enough. And the sanctions they ended up imposing on Iraq before the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the sanctions the United Nations imposed, the international law imposed on Iraq between 1991 and 2003, led to what they say now was up to 2 million deaths because of malnutrition, because of lack of access to medication, because of other restrictions. And nobody accounts for that. It is famously, Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State of the United States in the 90s, is quoted that when she was confronted with the question that around 500,000 kids have died and perished because of United States and United Nations sanctions on Iraq, she famously turned around and said, well, it was well worth it. And what was another outcome of that intervention by the United Nations and the US was that Kuwait ended up becoming one of the biggest and permanent military outposts of United States in the region, which further allowed further expansion and military presence of United States in the region. Similarly, we see another example where the NATO did not take permission of United Nations and in the name and pretext of protecting human rights, bombed the Serbs and tried to liberate Kosovo as they claimed. But eventually what ended up happening is they ended up using depleted uranium and other banned weapons on civilian populations. And Kosovo also ended up being one of the biggest military bases of United States in the region and allowed for NATO to reassert itself and assert its relevance in the post-Cold War era. Two other examples where we saw that international law only intervened, or international powers only appeared to have intervened in order to save people or save victims, but eventually it was a power grab in terms of the local economy, is the Indonesia and East Timor dispute. Indonesia invaded East Timor. The eve of the invasion, or the day before that, the United States president was present in Indonesia, green lighting the invasion. For 24 years, nearly 1/3 of East Timor's population, they claim, was wiped out. And eventually, in 1997, when the ruler of Indonesia, who was very much pro to Western allies, his government fell because of local uprising and revolt, international law claimed to, or international powers claimed to intervene to support and save East Timor. But what they ended up doing was they forced a new economy of East Timor into signing agreements and giving up their oil and gas reserves to countries like Australia. And that was again a power grab in terms of taking control of its reserves. We saw a similar action taking place in South Africa, where for 46 years, the apartheid of South Africa was allowed to take place. Margaret Thatcher, the United Kingdom under Margaret Thatcher, and the United States under Ronald Reagan vetoed multiple resolutions condemning the apartheid in South Africa. And it was only because of global solidarity, because of local uprising, because of awareness amongst the masses and the people of the world that it became difficult to defend the apartheid in South Africa. And even when the American Congress passed the Anti-Apartheid Act, it was then again vetoed by Ronald Reagan, and the Congress had to override him. And finally, when apartheid apparently ended, the Western powers and Western corporates again were present and continue to remain in South Africa to privatize and to perpetuate their control of the South African resources and their economy. Now, in this context and with this baggage, you have to see and what is happening in Gaza and what is happening in Palestine. That do these international institutions, do these international treaties, do these international laws actually exist with the promise that they will be implemented and they will be put in force to protect human dignity, liberty, sovereignty, or are they only a means to engage, to frustrate, and to exhaust people of the third world or the global south in endless debates in first trying to legally win the case to determine whether ethnic cleansing is taking place or not, whether genocide is taking place or not, whether war crimes are taking place or not, whether collective punishment is being meted out to the Gazans or not, before we actually can develop the kind of pressure which leads to any intervention. And even when intervention happens, I've already laid it out to you that it is only there to further expand the control. One example in the Palestinian context, though related more to West Bank and less to Gaza, are the Oslo Accords. They exist multiple resolutions by the UN which recognize the territory of Palestine, which recognize their right to self-determination, which recognize the fact that the refugees have a right to return to their land. However, the United States in trying to pretend to be a forceful and an effective arbitrator and being the only player which has the key to peace in the region, could technically ask both players to suspend what the international law said, suspend what the United Nations resolution said, and come to Camp David and enter into negotiations where technically an occupying force was made to sit across the table with an occupied people. So Israel and Palestine never really have equal bargaining power. And the United States said...
Mr. Jibran, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Could you please just wind up your talk now?
Sure, just give me 2 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
This is important for people to understand that the United Nations said that, let's forget about what the resolution says, what the UN resolution says about Palestine and the territory of Palestine. Let's work towards our own made-up peace procedure. And what it ended up doing was giving a 5-year proposal that let's break up the current West Bank into 3 zones: Zone A, Zone B, Zone C. And what has effectively happened, and what was originally a 5-year proposal, which is still in place in 2025, has become a permanent solution now, or a way forward now, that Palestinians only control 18% of the West Bank. 82% of the West Bank is under direct influence of Israel civilian control and military control. And the West Bank has now been carved into such a silo that there is no possibility of any reunification of Palestinian lands. So despite the ICC or the ICJ issuing warrants or declaring the West Bank wall illegal or claiming that there is a plausible case of genocide, until and unless it is the people of the world, it is united action and global solidarity, which has shown in the past that that is the only thing which brings about any real change. And international law and these institutions have unfortunately proven themselves to be a mere facade and a mere tool in the hands of the colonizer and the oppressor, even after 500 years.
अगर आपको हमारा काम पसंद आया है तो वीडियो को लाइक कीजिए, चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कीजिए, कमेंट करके अपना फीडबैक दीजिए और अपने दोस्तों के साथ वीडियो लिंक को शेयर कीजिए।